Hey everyone out there, and welcome back to Nat Chat. I'm Nat Eliason, and we are currently exploring what to do as a college student or recent graduate who feels like the current education system and typical post-grad careers just aren't working out for them. In this episode, we have Lucas Miller. I found Lucas through Max Friedman, who came on for episode 5, since Lucas used Max's platform, GiveButter, in order to crowdfund his book, Beyond Brilliance. As a student, Lucas went deep on the science of learning and memorization to figure out how he could rapidly accelerate his learning and make college effortless. After realizing how useful his learning hacking tactics were for himself, he and a small team combined their knowledge on learning and productivity into Lucas's book Beyond Brilliance, which you can find on Amazon or on his site at beyondbrilliance.org. For the interview, we went through how Lucas learned all of this, practical tactics students can use to drastically reduce their time on learning, memorization, school, and new skill development. We also dug in on using nonfiction books as research tools, consolidating knowledge as you're learning it, and a lot more. If you want to get more done, remember more, learn faster, spend less time on schoolwork, or even self-publish a book, this is your episode. One quick note. In the episode, I said beyondbrilliance.com. It's actually beyondbrilliance.org, which is where you can find out more about the book and the project and about what Lucas is working on. And with that, let's welcome Lucas to the show. Lucas, welcome, and really excited to have you on here today.
Yeah, excited to be on here too.
Yeah, so there's a ton that we could really cover here about learning hacking, study hacking, and work hacking to save listeners a lot of time with work that they don't want to be doing to get more out of college and their education. And I'm really excited to talk about it because this was something that was helpful for me when I was in college, learning some of it. And then you took tons of this knowledge and put it into your book, Beyond Brilliance. And hopefully, we're going to cover a lot of the good stuff in there and hopefully tease out some of the other bonus material maybe that would be great for the audience. And I think a really good way to kick the discussion off is to ask, why don't our schools care about us? Because you have a great section that I thought illuminated really well the issue with the design of schools and why that's problematic. And I think it could be valuable for people to hear.
Sure. Well, the major point on this topic that I mentioned in my book is basically that schools were designed a long time ago. They were designed basically like factories from 18th century England. That's why you have bells and everything's super organized, and it's almost like a factory. You're grouped up by age, which is completely arbitrary. Some people are better at math when they're younger, some people are better at English, and that system has really stayed with us for 100 years, basically since the start of public education. And you're treated like a number, and if you deviate from the path at all, it adds more work to the administration's belt. It makes it harder for teachers, and so they really try and make everyone kind of follow this standard mold. You take this set of classes this year, move on, and then eventually we ship you out. You go off to college, you get your job, whatever.
So as a student then, if you're in high school or college, what do you do about that? Because obviously we're probably not going to completely change the way that our schools are run, at least from the inside and in the short term. So what do you do as a student who is kind of locked into that system?
Sure. The first thing I think you do is kind of figure out what you really enjoy. If you really hate a certain subject, chances are you're not going to eventually grow to love it or to pursue it in college or to pursue that for a career. So the first step is just to figure out, what really gets you excited. What do you like to learn about on the side? Maybe that's science. Maybe it's a particular aspect of science like biology. So you figure out your strengths and then you try to, within the system, really focus on your strengths. So maybe that's taking an extra elective in that field so that you become more focused on that, and then you kind of differentiate.
And you have a lot in the book about hacking some of this learning process. And I think we can dive straight into that then, because if somebody recognizes they're in this system and they don't want to just be pushed out into the type of factory work, they're going to have to take some of it into their own hands, like you said.
Definitely.
So in that sense, you almost have to reduce the amount of time that you spend on normal school stuff so that you have more time for other things, right?
Yeah, you have to prioritize with school, you have to prioritize with life, definitely.
So what do you think students waste the most time on right now?
In terms of what they're doing in life, or in terms of what they're doing when they're studying, when they're trying to actually learn material?
In terms of when they're trying to actually learn material, because if you're talking about learning beyond the classroom, learning on your own projects, then you sort of want to optimize how quickly you can get all of the normal school stuff done, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think those are kind of split up a little bit. When it comes to school stuff, I think where most time is wasted is just on not knowing the best methods to take advantage of how your brain actually encodes and stores information. I mean, I'm sure you know this too from your own research. You go through school and you repeatedly get taught what to learn, right? Trigonometry, American history. It's all about this body of content that you should supposedly know as an educated American, but they never dive into how to learn, right? The sets of techniques that have been discovered over pretty much the last decade, maybe two of research. So it's still pretty new stuff, but that really shows you that there are ways that you can really accelerate the process just by ditching a few methods that are really popular in school. Rereading is probably the number one example, in favor of some less popular methods that seem a little harder, like forcing yourself to recall the material shortly after you've learned it, but are a little more difficult.
What's wrong with rereading? Why doesn't that work?
Sure. So rereading is a really popular strategy. It's used by about 90% of high school and college students as their number one method. And the big issue with rereading is that it creates what's called the illusion of mastery. So basically what that is you reread something and let's say you're rereading your notes. You start to become pretty familiar with the content that's going to be on the test. You start to think that because you're familiar with it, you can actually, on test day, recall all that from memory, that you have a true understanding of the material. So what happens is people pour through their notes, they pour through their slides, and they mistake being really familiar with those notes or those slides with true understanding until you actually test yourself and with no help, no notes, no Google, say, what is this concept? How does it work? And force yourself to actually reproduce it with no help. You don't know whether or not you're going to be able to perform when you're actually asked a set of questions on that material.
So that's the recall and retrieval that you were mentioning before, right?
Yeah. It's hands down the best way to learn something quickly.
So what are good ways that we can practice retrieval and recall for things that we're trying to learn in school or out?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this isn't just for school. I mean, as you know, learning doesn't stop once you get out of school. To stay relevant, you always have to be learning new things, staying on top of trends. So a method that works really well for me is just basic flashcards. And some people prefer paper, some people prefer software programs. There's a really cool program that I use called Anki, spelled Anki.
Yeah, Anki's fantastic.
Yeah. So as you know, it's a software program that lets you build flashcards, but it's really cool because there are a bunch of features that let you add pictures or fill in the blank. And it also schedules your review automatically. So if you know something really well, it's not going to have you review that flashcard tomorrow. And if you know something not as well, it might kind of kick it to the top of the queue. So you get a little more practice.
Yeah. And that's all based on this forgetting curve idea, right?
Yeah. A bunch of scientists figured out the optimal times that you should review something, and it ends up being just before you're about to forget it. And then they just built that into how the software program works.
Yeah. And that's actually built into a lot of language learning tools, right? Like Duolingo, I know, uses the spaced repetition to tell you when to practice things. I think Memorize does as well. And a lot of language learners use Anki for picking things up quickly, right?
Yeah. Spaced repetition is a magic bullet. I mean, the analogy of, do you water your lawn once a week for 90 minutes or 3 times a week for 20 minutes is pretty much what spaced repetition is all about. Short, infrequent sets of review are way better than long bursts.
Yeah. You mentioned that rereading was probably one of the biggest things people waste time on. What would you say are the next one or two?
Highlighting and underlining. So let me preface this by saying that they're not entirely bad.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens, at least from my experience, when people highlight and underline is they tend to do it indiscriminately. I remember when I took AP United States history, people would pick up the textbook and they basically underline everything because the thought process is, okay, I've underlined or highlighted this little nugget of knowledge that I'm sure to remember it. And unfortunately, that's just not how we encode information. If you want to do it here and there, maybe it's a really important term or it's a really important graph, that's fine. So that when you come back and study, you know that this is important. But if you're just filling up your pages or your notes with different colors, it's not going to help you.
So is there any good form of highlighting, underlining, or is that just also something that you should scrap in favor of something like Anki?
I mean, I'm always in favor of the latter. I think a little bit of trial and error is definitely something people can try. I mean, there are general principles that are based on science, but everyone's different. Some people maybe are great at making those visual associations they need when they highlight something. So yeah, it just depends on what works best for people. But across the board, when you indiscriminately mark things, it does not help. Let me think. A couple other common techniques that people should scrap. I think probably another really big culprit out there is passive note taking. So you get into a lecture hall and the professor starts talking, right?
Hmm.
The professor's up at the front, he's lecturing for the entirety of the class, and you're just scribbling down everything he or she says. You're writing so fast that you don't have any time to simplify the material, organize it, determine if what was actually said is actually important. And that's something that really trips people up.
What's a better system for note taking then?
Yeah, I would say a better system is to really focus on the key points, which are generally easy to find because the professor will repeat them. So really focusing on what are the key points, what are the details that support those key points. You're really looking for the gist, and then when you go back and review, you can find the specifics from the textbook or from the slides that kind of bolster those key points. But in general, if you're just writing the whole time, there's not too much processing going on. Listening is really important, especially the first time. When it's new material, you just kind of want to listen. And then when you dive in a second time, you can get into the nitty gritty a little more.
So, if we were designing a perfect study system based on some of this research that you've done, what would that look like? And maybe that's the system that you use yourself.
Well, I wouldn't say my system is perfect. Far from it.
Close to perfect.
Yeah, I mean, I think really great study systems are based on principles that people apply to a variety of subjects, whether that's history or math. I think a great system, whether it's for an actual class you're taking or whether you're trying to learn something on your own, is figure out what you want to learn before you actually go out and learn it. This is something very few people do because it seems kind of trivial, but really identifying your goals before you actually embark on the learning process is really important because it's going to help your brain latch onto those things that'll really help you achieve your goals. So, number one, figuring out what's most important to you. Number two, going in with an open mind. I think that's really important for people because a lot of people, when they try to learn about a new subject, come in with a bunch of pre-existing ideas of how things are or how things should work, and they look to confirm those ideas. So going in with an open mind. And then three, in some cases, can supplant the other two methods, is just testing. Like the best way to figure out if you know something, whether it's for a midterm in school or for a job interview, or if you're trying to learn accounting for a business you're starting, is to just test yourself. Grab a test off the internet, find some questions, and just see if you actually know the material. If you know half of it, great. You can move on to the other half that maybe you're a little bit less proficient in.
And you must have done a lot of experimenting with your own methods and a lot of trial and error to figure a lot of this stuff out. How did you get in the habit of experimenting with your own habits and processes? What started that process for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think experimentation in general is a great way to improve yourself. There's an old adage out there, you can't improve what you don't measure. So you need to make little tweaks here and there and see if the results help you or hurt you. I think what really kind of started this experimentation phase was after reading Moonwalking with Einstein. That was pretty much the impetus for this whole project. For those who haven't read it, it's a book by a journalist.
It's Josh Foyer, right?
Yes, yeah. It's a journalist who covered the U.S. Memory Championships in 2005. All those people who can memorize decks of cards in 20 seconds. And he was fascinated. And he said, okay, I want to train for this. I want to see if I can do it. And he ended up coming back the next year and winning it. So it's all about memory, how it works, and how people who don't think they have great memories can actually pull off some pretty amazing feats. And so he introduces all these methods that the ancients have used. And so I just, from there, started applying that to my schoolwork. Does this work better? Does my old strategy work better? And then from there, just kind of taking everything I found in different books and different studies and applying them to my own life and seeing if they actually had a positive result. And most of the time, I didn't notice a difference. I mean, that's just how things go. And really well-designed experiments have great controls, and it's hard to do that when there's so many different things that could affect the result, as is the case in life.
So it's always hard doing live experiments and trying to get good sound data
Yeah.
when you're playing with so many variables in your day-to-day experience. What would you say are the maybe 2 or 3 of those experiments that have moved the needle the most for you, besides Anki and some of the stuff that we've already talked about?
Sure. I would say sleep, number one. I used to get maybe 6, 7 hours of sleep at most per night. And after I started reading about the role of sleep and learning memory, how it affects your mood, your processing speed, there's a whole gamut of brain function that sleep really controls. I committed to getting at least 8 hours. Now I'm averaging about 9. And I found that dramatically improved my performance. I could pick stuff up quicker, retain it better. I didn't have trouble focusing for a long period of time. And I think that's something that is really hard for students and people in America in general to prioritize. It seems like wasted time, because you're practically unconscious, not doing anything. But sleep is super important for A, putting yourself in a position to learn well, and B, actually taking all that stuff you learned the day before and re-rehearsing it and consolidating it so that you will remember it going forward.
So you didn't find any loss in productivity from having fewer hours in your day?
No, I found that I was more productive because the hours I was working, I was more focused and I could get more done.
Yeah, I've had pretty much the exact same experience with sleep. And now I don't even use an alarm clock anymore for the most part. Just try to wake up with fake sun in my room, kind of like a light that brightens up. And that's been a big improvement as well.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to do that as a student when, your day is shifting all the time. Some days your classes are earlier or later, but over time, if you do commit to it, you can develop a pretty awesome schedule that keeps you feeling great pretty much throughout the whole day.
Especially if you wake up a little bit earlier than everyone else. I find that always makes a big difference.
Yeah, there's kind of this I'm awake before the enemy feeling. You feel like you're conquering the world a little bit while everyone's sleeping.
Yeah, exactly. What else besides sleep? Like favorite self-experiments?
So I'd say the productivity experiments were the next most impactful. And what that consisted of for me was tracking every activity I did for an entire week.
Just in a spreadsheet or?
I actually live tweeted it. I made a separate Twitter account. It was Lucas is now doing.
Is that still live? Can we send people to it?
It's not still live.
Ah, too bad.
I was careful to remove it because I was very accurate with my tracking.
Lucas is now pooping.
Yeah, basically. But I wanted to see if there were any patterns throughout the week, especially when it came to studying. Was I consistently switching over to Facebook or chatting with my friends if I lost some steam or got bored? And once you kind of commit to really bringing attention to your behaviors, you start to kind of see, this is why I'm not being productive. Or here's maybe a little routine switch I could add to help myself avoid this and start doing this.
I imagine even just the process of having to tweet everything you're doing would disincentivize you from goofing off quite so much.
Yeah, especially since a few of my friends had access to it.
So they could actually see.
I told them that I would pay them if they caught me and I wasn't doing what I said I was doing.
Tell them to berate you endlessly in person too.
Yeah, but I think in general, a way you can approach productivity experimentations is just taking notes on your routine, writing down every instance of getting off track. That's pretty easy to do. Take out a flashcard or an index card and just tally every time you feel the need to do something that's not productive. And you'll start to kind of pick up on those cues and then ways of avoiding that behavior in favor of one that you actually want to be executing on.
What were some of those cues for you or common other ones that you've seen?
One is definitely boredom. And that's tough just because sometimes you have to do work or study something and it's just boring to you.
Especially in school when you're taking a class that you don't like.
Yeah. Another one I think is just being a little fatigued. If you're studying for an hour and you're really engaging with the material and it's hard work, you're going to get tired over time. And so as you get tired, you tend to lose willpower and gravitate towards the low hanging fruit. And so a really effective way to combat jumping over to social media or whatever is just take a break. Take a break, walk around, grab some water, just kind of give your mind a respite. I mean, this is the crux of the Pomodoro technique, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yeah, but listeners might not know it, so you should.
Yeah. I was just going to jump into it. So the Pomodoro technique is a really simple productivity strategy, but it's been used by millions throughout the United States. And what it consists of is working for 25 minutes straight. So set a timer, you do your work for 25 minutes, no distractions, no interruptions. And then at the end of that 25 minutes, you give yourself a 5-minute break. And during that break, you can do whatever you want, talk to your friends, get up, have a snack, doesn't matter. And so the way it works is you just repeat these cycles of 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off. And it seems to be a really effective way to get work done over a long period of time without feeling that fatigue that can come from working for, 2 hours without a break. Some people will do 50 minutes on, 10 minutes off. It just depends on what works best for you. And there's some really cool Chrome extensions or online timers you can use to make that super easy to do.
The ones that kind of keep perpetually going and alerting you when to move from one phase to the next, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's also that kind of breaking up your time is really good for memory, right?
Yeah. Typically, we'll remember things best if they were first or last. So if you have a really long period of 2 hours, let's say, you're going to remember the stuff at the beginning and the stuff at the end best on average. If that's broken up into 4, 30-minute periods, you're going to have more peaks throughout that 2-hour period.
Yeah. And I think that's where the Pomodoro technique is really strong, is for when you have to buckle down and especially study something or also just burn out work that you're not super excited about doing.
Yeah.
The one area where I find it's hard to use it sometimes is with writing or more creative work, because
Can't do that.
Well, but there's a caveat. There's a caveat here. I still really like using it as a way to just make myself get started, because it's almost like, okay, I'll set this 20-minute timer, but I won't have a vocal alarm for it. And then I'd say, okay, I just have to work for these 20 minutes on the writing or editing or whatever. And at the end of it, I have permission to stop. But if I'm really in it, then I'll just keep going. And what I find a lot of the times is that at the end of the 20 minutes, I'm super into it and we'll just keep going for an hour or two. But then again, if you're not, once you see that the timer's up, you can always stop.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, it always depends on what works best for you. But oftentimes just getting in that new mindset of it's work time can be enough to help you really commit to whatever you're trying to do and not get distracted.
Yeah, and really getting into that flow, right? Which is another thing that you talked a lot about in the book, something, I'm super interested in as well. So flow, we'll go ahead and explain flow just in case anyone listening isn't super familiar with it.
Sure. Yeah. So flow is a term that scientists have come up with to describe kind of that feeling when you're fully focused, you are energized, you feel like you're really getting stuff done. Sometimes you forget what time it is, or you don't even care. It's really hard to be distracted. You're in the zone, and that can be when you're writing, when you're at the gym. It's basically peak performance, and it's been a really interesting topic that scientists are starting to study.
And how does somebody get into flow? Because there's a lot of benefits to having it or to being in it, right?
Yeah, I would say the biggest benefit is just not being distracted, because interruption kills productivity.
So the best way to get into it is to just not be interrupted, or the best benefit from it is that you're resistant to interruptions?
The latter, the best benefit. Yeah. In terms of getting into it, it's still a matter of debate. There's no magic bullet. If you do 1, 2, 3, eat some blueberries, you're going to get into flow. But the best way you can get into flow is by doing something you enjoy. It's really hard to get into it if you're doing drudge work, you're doing emails or whatever. So the best thing is just doing something you enjoy. It's something that you're really committed to. You're committed to the end result, especially. And then another thing is just making sure your environment is really conducive to getting that work done. It's going to be really hard to zone in if there are people around, there are cars driving by, your little brother's playing video games next door. So what I found and what most of the people I've talked about this with have found is if you're by yourself and you kind of create an environment where you won't face that many distractions, um, after 10 or 15 minutes of working, people start to forget about where they are and only focus on that work.
And what tends to knock people out of it?
Well, so number one would be someone or something interrupting you. So friend comes up, asks you about what's going on this weekend or whatever. And then a second one is blood sugar.
Blood sugar.
Yeah.
How does that relate to it?
In order to be really attentive, you need to have high blood sugar. So what I recommend for people who are trying to get into flow and get a lot of work done over a long period of time, have snacks next to them. And that can be blueberries or nuts, something healthy that can kind of up your blood sugar and keep it stable over time. Because if you get to a point where you have low blood sugar, it's pretty hard to jump back into flow without taking a break and getting it to spike up again.
So you just have to keep it consistent. You don't want the dip in blood sugar, right?
Yeah, you don't want spikes and dips. So don't eat Skittles or whatever, but if you have some blueberries or a protein bar or something, have a little snack every 30 minutes or take a bite here and there. And that does wonders for keeping you focused for a long period of time.
Yeah, because that's probably related to the fatigue problem, right? It's pretty hard to get anything done when you're tired.
Yeah. And also lots of water.
Lots of water, yeah.
Your brain blows through fluids. And if the concentration of water is even a little bit off normal, it impairs your performance.
That was a huge, I guess you'd call it life hack for me too, just drinking more water throughout the day.
Yeah.
Because I had a roommate in high school who would just buy cases and cases of water and be drinking water nonstop. And I never got it until I tried it. And it's amazing how so many people are kind of perpetually dehydrated and missing out on that good feeling that comes from just getting back to normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Have you played with fasting or anything at all in terms of maintaining that stable blood sugar to get more flow?
I haven't actually. I know that Tim Ferriss and some of the people who circle around him have tried it, but I actually haven't. I considered doing it in high school, but this was mainly for physical performance for sports. But I found that I had really low energy all the time. And maybe that was just not trying it out for long enough. I did it for about a week, but I found that there are ways that I was more comfortable with to, get everything I need to get done and stay at a high performing place. What about you? Have you jumped into that space?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been doing intermittent fasting for 7 years now.
Okay.
So like 16/8. And half of the reason that I do it now is that the feeling when I wake up where I haven't eaten yet until about 2 p.m. is by far just the productive part of my day. I find that as soon as I add food, it's like ratchets down by 10-20%.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're starting to divert resources to your stomach from your head.
It's probably the ketones versus glucose aspect as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's another part with flow and, learning these skills and deliberate practice around getting really good at stuff too. And you mentioned some problems with the 10,000 hour rule, which I think a lot of people know, but it's maybe not completely accurate. So can you explain what those maybe qualms with it are?
Sure. Yeah. So for those who don't know, the 10,000 hour rule was a rule that was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in Outliers to kind of describe the number of hours you need to become expert at something. So in Outliers, he looked at everyone from chess players to musicians to hockey players, and he found that to be truly an expert at something, you need to put in a lot of hours and a lot of years. And the issue with that is another scientist who Malcolm Gladwell closely worked with, whose name is Anders Ericsson. He's a professor at the University of Florida, considered the world's expert on experts, has come out recently and said that, yeah, I mean, obviously you need to put in a lot of hours to become really good at something, but not all practice is the same, right? You can go out and shoot jump shots for 10,000 hours, but that actually might not make you as good at jump shots as, let's say, shooting from just in front of the free throw line and just behind the free throw line. Kind of interesting. But
So why is that better? Why is mixing it up better?
mixing it up is better because when you add variety, your brain learns. I mean, this is for a physical skill. Your brain and your muscles learn exactly how much output is required to get a desired result. It kind of it hones this ability to determine what to do in a new, unfamiliar state. So if you're mixing it up and you're shooting from the right, you're shooting from the left, when you're actually in a game and the environment's different, right, that practice will transfer. Whereas if you're just practicing the same exact thing, if anything is off when you're actually forced to perform, you might mess up a little bit.
So then if we want to actually get really good at something, we can't just blindly put in 10,000 hours doing it, right?
Yeah, yeah. The goal is to figure out what are the basic elements of a skill. So I'll stick with a basketball analogy. It's not just shooting, right? It's dribbling, it's footwork. There are a few key sources that contribute to overall basketball skill. So the idea is when you practice, you want to focus on a specific element that you're trying to master. And then what you want to do is go just outside your comfort zone enough so you're really pushing the limits of your ability. And then right after, you want to get some kind of feedback. Ideally, it's from a coach if that's not possible from yourself, right? You want to assess after the fact, did I do a good job or did I mess up here? Should I try and fix this next time?
What about for non-physical skills? Does this carry over to things like writing, design, programming?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So I would say let's use writing as an example. The best way to get better at writing in most people's minds would be just to write, just to keep writing, eventually get better at it. Make sense? That certainly will work over time. Practice will improve your ability, but there are ways of focusing in on really specific elements of writing that will help you accelerate that skill improvement process. So one really great way to do that is to read something that's really well written, read through it a couple times, and then see if you can reproduce that in your own words. And that really trains your ability to use complex vocabulary, create new sentence structures. It really trains your ability to mimic the best writers out there versus just grabbing a pen and paper right in the morning and just free flowing. There are definitely benefits to that, but practicing in very specific ways can eventually make the whole greater than the sum of the parts.
I think that was something from Ben Franklin's autobiography, right? That he talked about how he got better as he took samples of writing and he had a few different ways of doing it, right? Because he would just copy the words to get the feel, and then he would try to recreate it in his own words and then compare them and see how they differed. And then I think he also did it with poetry, right? Because he wanted to get better at word choice. And so going back to what you were saying about identifying the different parts of the skill, kind of like breaking up the ways you practice it into those different components.
Yeah, I think another analogy that might be a little easier to understand is, let's say you're a tennis player and you're practicing serves. Obviously, serving more is going to make you a better server, but if you're just serving and you don't have any kind of purpose, you're not doing yourself enough service because there are specific elements of a serve, like power, like spin. Those are good examples. So it's best to focus on those elements. So you're just going to focus on one type of serve, right? Flat serve right up the middle. You're going to do that and you're going to immediately get feedback. And then after you've done that, you can switch over to tweaking another element.
So I feel like this is something that we can probably use for general school learning as well. Right? It's almost the same as the recall and retrieval that you were talking about before, just applied to physical skills and more niche. It seems like there's very similar overlapping elements.
Definitely.
You clearly read a lot and had to have read a lot to do this research. What started that habit for you? What got you into reading voraciously like this?
I think I've always enjoyed reading. It was something that was emphasized in my house. I think as I got into middle school and high school, I kind of backed off a little bit. This happens with most people. You start having to read for school. You start having to read a lot of books for English class that frankly aren't that interesting and aren't that relevant to life. And so it definitely sours a lot of people on reading.
I think anything that you read that somebody tells you to read, it's way harder to take with you.
Exactly. Yeah, you nailed it on the head. So most people, after being told for years, you need to read this and not being too interested in it, kind of lose the habit. But I've always found reading to be one of the best ways to learn. I mean, if you really think about it, let's just take a nonfiction book, for example. Some expert spent 20, 30 years getting good in a certain field, making tons of mistakes, learning most of the key principles you need to succeed in that field. And then they went through all the work of taking all the stuff that really matters and putting it into 200 pages that you can get through in a week or a weekend if you really want to blow through it. It seems like, at least to me, one of the best ways you can accelerate your learning.
And it's surprisingly cheap.
Oh, yeah, it's super cheap.
What were you going to say about articles? Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say articles and other tidbits are great, but I've always found that books occupy a special niche, and it's been hard for me to find a better way to learn, especially if I want to learn about a specific topic, let's say like marketing.
And I don't know about you, but I've found it almost impossible to read anything on a screen anymore. And I feel like it's so much easier to spend a long time reading a book than it is to spend a long time reading articles, because you get pulled in a million directions once you have the computer open.
Yeah, it definitely depends. I know most young people prefer screens and phones and whatnot. I'm kind of in the middle. I always prefer having the physical text, but for price and convenience purposes, I've recently switched over to a Kindle.
Yeah, Kindle's fantastic.
Yeah.
Do you take notes while you read?
Yeah.
What's your system look like?
So I found that the best way for me to take notes on books is to index the book. So I have a system where I don't take notes in the book because I'm just weird. I don't like messing up the pages. I'll bring out a piece of paper and I'll write, I don't know, page 16 Q for quote. So I have a index system. It's based off of the system that Ryan Holiday uses. And who's the other lady? She runs.
Oh, Marie Popova?
Yes. It's based on that system, more or less. So I'll create an index of great quotes, main ideas, things I disagree with, maybe experiment that was mentioned. And then I'll just have a one pager that kind of helps me when I want to review that book, jump to the pages where all the meat is. So yeah, I'll read it, create my index. I then let the book sit for about a week, and then I'll come back and I'll go chapter by chapter and use the recall method. So I'll look at the chapter name and then try to reproduce from memory whatever I can that was relevant to that chapter. And then I figure out, okay, did I get all the key pieces? Did I miss something? And then I'll actually go and do a more detailed sweep, add more to my notes, and then I'll store them in Evernote, just a digital note-taking application.
Do you have any kind of master Anki deck for everything you've learned from books?
I put everything in my Anki in the same deck.
Oh, so you have one deck for all of your books.
I have one deck, and then I tag the ideas based on where they came from, so the book or the author, and then the topic.
I love that. That's something that I've been meaning to do for a long time with my book notes and haven't gotten around to it. Anki's such a great system for that stuff.
I've found that, there are definitely disadvantages to putting it all together, but things that seemingly don't go together, like, I don't know, design and ancient India or something, at some point you'll find some connection that helps you make your point or illuminate something about life you didn't know. There are a lot of connections between disciplines that aren't obvious. So I found putting everything together helps me kind of synthesize more than if I put everything business related into one deck, everything design related into another.
And it probably helps too with preventing contextual memory, right? Where
yes,
you're only remembering something because it's in a certain context. And so if you have it all clumped together, then you get a much better general understanding of it and can probably remember it in more situations than if you were just remembering it within the context of this certain deck.
Definitely.
How do you pick good books to learn from then? Because it sounds like each book is a pretty big investment for you. And do you have some system for which ones you read?
Typically, the way I read is I'll pick a topic. So right now I'm trying to go through some business books on sales. So I'll pick a topic like that, and then I'll figure out who the leading people are in that field. So CEOs, they're good at sales for the most part. And then I'll just comb through their recommendations, books that they found to be super helpful, books that have stood the test of time are usually good. They've been around for a while. They've been reprinted multiple times. A new forward was added. Those books tend to be a lot better edited, a lot more thought put into them, and more useful. But yeah, I would say go to the people you already trust. Right? If you follow a certain blogger or you really admire a certain business person or a scientist or a politician, even figure out what books they enjoy, what they recommend, and you'll typically find that you enjoy those as well.
So then if you were going to give, say, 3 books to the incoming students at Berkeley, what would they be?
Sure. So I get this question all the time.
Nice.
I would say number 1 is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg.
That's actually the book that got me started on the reading habit.
Okay.
Amazing book.
Yeah, it's a really interesting book about why we do what we do in business and life. It's all about basically what habits are and how we can change them. Another one is Mastery by Robert Greene. Amazing book. And as you might be able to guess, the topic is all about how do people become experts in their field. And so he just did a bunch of research on scientists and politicians and athletes, the greats throughout history. And he writes about their stories and kind of extracts the key principles that can take you from novice to I'm starting to get the hang of things to pretty good, but there's still room for improvement to you're the best in your field. People look up to you. You have a really deep, intuitive sense of how to get stuff done in your space. And then let's see.
I'm also going to give a plug for Mastery while you think of the third one. That's definitely my favorite book I've read on the beginning to end of skill acquisition. Especially, what I like about what Robert Greene does is that he's not using psych studies that might turn out to be non-repeatable later. He's actually using historical vignettes and stories to explain it, which I feel like is a much more robust way of explaining a lot of these processes. And you've got all these great stories woven throughout it, so you're learning history too.
Yeah, I totally agree. He's an incredible writer, and it's definitely a structure that most people don't follow, but I think works really well in his favor. And then I'd say the third one is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. This is a book about cognitive biases. So basically what that means is what tricks does your mind employ to do less work? This is kind of the book that launched the science of decision making. Before this book, economics was all about kind of rational decision making. Everyone is perfectly rational. We have all the information and we use logic to make every decision that we're faced with. This is kind of the book that said, there's more to it. People have all of these intrinsic preferences for certain things that might not make perfect logical sense. An example is make sense out of a lot of things that don't make sense. Like that's why oftentimes in science, people will publish something. They'll say, we found meaning in the data. And really that's just them wanting to find meaning in the data. Yeah, there's definitely a lot more I could say about that. It is a little more technical of a book, but it basically explores why we do what we do, which is always something that is relevant no matter what you're doing.
Yeah, it is really cool too, because he's the one who did all of the research that so many of these other books are summarizing.
Yes. He's been cited many times since that was written.
I feel like Paradox of Choice is kind of the easier version of Thinking Fast and Slow. It covers a lot of the same topics, but if you want to go to the source, that's really the one that you want to read, unless you want to read his original research papers, which are interesting too,
They are
but even more dense.
definitely. Yeah, I was actually going to mention the same book, the Barry Schwartz book.
Pretty much all of those are pretty interesting. And I feel like reading a few of them is good because it implants the ideas in your head a bit more. If you just read one and then try to go implement it and watch out for it, harder to do. You're not going to remember it as well. But once you read 3, 4, or 5 of those books and take notes on them and put them in your Anki, then you start to get pretty good.
Sure.
What do you think was the biggest mindset shift for you around learning and college and education, particularly, while you were a student?
I would say the biggest mindset shift for me was kind of learning about the general idea of neuroplasticity. So, in very simple terms, what that means is the brain can change over time, right? We're not born with a set of hardware like a computer that stays the same from birth until death, right? The brain is constantly rewiring itself. If you feed it really stimulating, challenging material, then your brain will, in essence, get smarter. So really learning about that was very mobilizing. I kind of realized if I just reinforce good habits and I focus on learning over time, I can, as I mentioned before, kind of become smarter in a sense. I think a lot of people in school suffer from what's called the fixed mindset, where you think, okay, I've been given this brain from birth. It works how it works, and I'm good at these things, and I'm bad at these things, and nothing will ever change. And that's something that a lot of teachers on the forefront are starting to realize is definitely not true. Even people who don't like math, never thought they were good at it, have been able to turn around and really excel. Some go on to study math in college, some go on to be professors. That's the focus of another book kind of in the space called A Mind for Numbers.
Oh, yeah. Who's that one by? Do you remember?
Barbara Oakley. She's a engineering professor in Oakland, and she talks about how growing up she loved the humanities and shied away from math and science. And it kind of charts her realization that she really wanted a more stable academic career, and so she kind of jumped back into math and science and ended up doing super well.
And does it explain how is that the one where she kind of explains how she rewired her brain for math? I haven't read it.
Yeah, for the most part.
Very cool. Do you have a favorite failure or screw up, particularly from the last maybe 2 or 3 years since you started working on this stuff?
Oh, man.
And the reason I ask this is you're an accomplished dude, right? You published this book while still a student. You're wrapping up graduation. I think it's always fun to hear these kind of stories that we all have that humble us a bit.
Yeah, let me think. There are definitely plenty related to the book itself. I think if I were to ever do it again, I would do it very differently.
Oh, well, let's hear about that. I'm curious to hear, how would you do it differently?
Sure. I think a common mistake that first-time authors or first-time creators of anything make is that they kind of assume, okay, if I make it and then just release it, it'll spread. Everyone will latch onto it. They'll think my ideas are great, and then it'll be a success. And that's just not how it works. In the book space, anyone who wants to get their ideas heard spends months setting up interviews and guest blog posts and visits and whatever. They have this planned way ahead of time so that when the book, in this case, goes live, people already know about it. The typical process people follow when they're writing a book is they start blogging or they start posting videos on YouTube. They grow an audience. They grow a set of people who already likes their material, trust them, would buy some kind of product if they ever made one. And then they launch the product and they already have a set of people that are interested. What I did is I basically built the product and then had to clamor for that audience at the last minute. And it ended up working out. But I definitely think I would have spent more time setting seeds here and there before releasing the final product.
Well, you ended up doing a fundraising campaign for it, right? On GiveButter?
Yeah. So we ended up doing a fundraising campaign it was in August. Yeah. So we told our friends and family about what we were doing, why we were super passionate about the project, so we could raise money to help pay for the design, some editing stuff here and there. Yeah, the GiveButter guys were great. For those who don't know, GiveButter is basically an alternative to Kickstarter, but they don't take as much money and it's way more fun. And the guys who run it are awesome.
Max was actually on an earlier episode. So if anybody hasn't listened to that one, you should check it out too. Max is one of the co-founders. Well, so you're going to be, I mean, you're actually graduating in a few weeks, right?
Yep. My last day of class is today, and I have one more class after this.
That's pretty cool. Congrats. Do you know what you're going to be working on afterwards?
Yeah, for the most part. So I'm going to be staying in the Bay Area, and I'm working with a couple PhDs in neuroscience, kind of similar background, on a software company for large corporations. So basically taking a lot of stuff in my book about learning, productivity, training the brain so that you can get more done with less effort, less stress, and then get back to your friends and family, kind of bringing that to corporations. So sort of the next step.
Is it something that is live? Can people check it out, or is it?
It's not live yet.
Well, when it is, let us know, and we can let
Sure.
people know about it. Wrapping up then, any like last thoughts, pieces of advice, things that you wish you knew when you were starting college or in the middle or looking for careers, anything like that?
Yeah, I think one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten was actually from Saul Kahn, who is the founder of Khan Academy. It's a great site with tutorials on all kinds of subjects from history to math. And what it was is this was his strategy for figuring out what you want to do in life. And he said, it's really hard to figure out, okay, this is what I want to do, but it's super easy to figure out what you don't want to do. So let's say you come into college and you're intending on studying economics because it seems like a pretty solid path to end up going to Wall Street. What you should do is, sure, you can stick with that path, but you should be open-minded. You should try things that are out of your wheelhouse, and you should see if you like them. If you don't, that's fine. But one thing that he really recommended was try a bunch of things. If you don't like them, that's fine. You know that, but you'll never know if that was maybe a better path for you if you didn't try. Kind of that principle of negate and avoid I've found has been really helpful. Another piece of advice, this is more just general life advice. If you want to maximize learning, carry around a small little notepad and just write stuff down, because I can't tell you how many times I've been talking to someone or I went to hear someone speak and I said, oh, this is great. This is so interesting. I'm totally going to remember it. I'm totally going to write it down at some point. And then I forget and it's lost. So if you hear something interesting or you have a really insightful observation, just pull out your little notepad, take it around with you, and just write it down, because oftentimes you will forget, and then who knows if that little tidbit of knowledge will come back.
It's perfect. So thank you again, Lucas, for coming out, sharing all of this with the listeners. Where can people find you if they want to, reach out online? Twitter or? Yeah,
Twitter's great. That's usually my standard way of putting out content and interacting with people. My username is Lucas Allen Miller. And then I post articles once in a while on Medium, same username.
And obviously, everyone should check out Beyond Brilliance, the blueprint for learning anything, which is on Amazon. And where else?
It's just on Amazon. And then I've also put up the PDF on beyondbrilliance.org. I put the PDF up for free if anyone wants a digital version. I mostly want to spread this to as many people as possible.
No, I feel you. Charlie Hohen did the same thing with the Recession Proof Graduate.
Yeah, I've read that. It's a great one.
Also an earlier guest, if people want to listen to that one too. But yeah, so I think with that, Lucas, thank you so much again. Everyone, check out the book at beyondbrilliance.com. Hit up Lucas on Twitter. And yeah, go download Anki, get started, implement a lot of this stuff here. And yeah, Lucas, have a great rest of your day. Thanks for coming on.
You too, man. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Nat Chat. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe to Nat Chat in iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Second, if you're trying to take advantage of some of the information from this episode, be sure you check out the show notes at nateliason, nateliason.com/podcast, and find a friend, because implementing a lot of this stuff is much easier if you have somebody to do it with. And finally, If you enjoyed this episode and you've been enjoying other episodes of the podcast, please leave it a review on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to your casts so that more people can find it. This is the best way for it to get some more exposure and to make sure that I can keep bringing these episodes to you. With that, thank you and have an awesome rest of your day.